We want to begin by first thanking you all for the opportunity to bring together two projects that have a tremendous amount of natural resonance, and together to produce something new and innovative. So as a philosopher and a sociologist, we have each independently studied abuses committed by Christian churches against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, often abbreviated LGBT people, living in North America. Our collaborative project proposes to investigate two broad questions related to this research. First, what motivates non-LGBT church members to end these abusive practices, regardless of whether or not they believe homosexuality is sinful? And second, how do LGBT people who have been victims of what we call sacramental shame and other forms of spiritual violence overcome these harms in order to experience a loving God, to serve others, and to flourish? So we want to begin by defining our terms spiritual violence and sacramental shame. My recent philosophical research is aiming to clarify the nature of spiritual violence and understand its impact on spiritual and moral development. Spiritual violence is an umbrella term for a variety of practices that use religious means to degrade or demean a person in his or her relationship with God. It is violence in the sense of violation of persons, and it is distinctively spiritual in terms of both its means, which include religious texts, teachings, symbols, or rituals, and in terms of its target, or the thing that's harmed, which is the person's spiritual self and or relationship with God. So some examples of spiritual violence include interpretations of scripture that advance degrading views about LGBT people or same-sex relationships, clergy sexual abuse of children, in which the priest who represents God is simultaneously a source of sexual violation, and religious teachings or traditions that promote the spiritual inferiority of women to men in God's eyes. Now, these three cases are importantly different in many respects, but what they have in common is that in each case, the symbols, texts, rituals, or religious leaders that are supposed to foster loving relationship with God instead lead a person to experience God as hostile, unloving, or abusive, and thereby warp the spiritual formation of the self. But spiritual violence also undermines the moral formation of the self by erecting barriers to Christian virtue development. Experiencing God as hostile or abusive makes it very difficult for a person to develop Christian virtues such as charity and compassion, which are rooted in a loving relationship with God. The concept of sacramental shame emerged from Don's findings and is a form of spiritual violence. It is shame dispensed by the church and its members in an effort to bring an LGBT person closer to God. But paradoxically, respondents and authors of published testimonies say that this shame actually makes it more difficult to feel God's presence in their lives and to do the work of being Christian. So shame can inspire us to atone or apologize, but when a person is shamed for something that they can't change, the shame compels a kind of obsessive inward turning and focus on perpetually trying to fix oneself. Furthermore, sacramental shame comes with the message that God's love is conditional. You have to keep trying to change or fix yourself, or else God will think you've turned your back on him. And in these discourses, God is typically gendered male. Finally, in some instances, church leaders or members will insist that a person can't participate in the ministries of the church until they are reformed. And the shamed person can also feel unfit to serve until they are fixed.
All right. Clearly, we're talking about two different groups of people who require two different sets of questions. So regarding the LGBT Christians, they themselves can be categorized, first of all. One group agree with their church's traditional teachings that same-sex sexual activity is sinful, and so they commit to celibacy alongside claiming a lesbian or gay identity. And this is including in evangelical churches that normally eschew celibacy. Also, there are some conservative Christians, gays, and others who believe that same-sex marriage is just as good as or almost as good as different-sex marriage. And furthermore, the issue becomes a little more complicated when we take seriously the stories of bisexuals and transgender people who blur the cultural gender distinctions. They're often completely invisible in these discourses, but they're also working to articulate their own experiences of sexuality, faith, God, and so forth. So our research question regarding all of these groups is what helps to overcome spiritual violence? My previous research has led to the hypothesis that identifying oneself as LGBT, claiming that, say, I am a gay man or I am a transgender lesbian, actually helps to set aside the compulsion to fix oneself and to change. Respondents and authors of written testimonies have attested that claiming an LGBT identity allows them to feel like whole persons, to stop having to focus inward all the time, to be able to focus on serving others, and to experience God's presence in their lives. Regarding non-LGBT Christians, the question is, what creates the motivation to stop, to end spiritually violent practices, to listen to LGBT people, to let go of judgment, or in virtue ethics terms, to cultivate authentic Christian love? How do they come to this point? As a sociologist, I found support for the hypothesis that 4 mutually influential processes have made this move possible for individuals. So as a team, we're positing that ethical motivations are shaped by material conditions and social cultural forms. So one process began with the late 19th century emergence of sexuality in Western countries as the truth of who a person is. The notion that there is such a thing as sexual orientation and that it is part of what constitutes a person has not only made LGBT identity possible, but it has also made it easier for others to accept same-sex romantic relationships. The notion of sexual orientation as being experienced as unchosen was accepted to a certain extent by Roman Catholic leaders in North America in the mid-1970s, but it's only very recently come into evangelical thought. A second process has been the increase since the 1980s in the number and positivity of representations of LGBT people in mass media, which has changed the symbolism of sexual and gender variations. Particularly, images of lesbians and gay men as conforming to middle-class values has made these minorities seem unthreatening, in contrast to images of sexual minorities as uncontrollable, perverted hedonists that many of my respondents report learning in church. These two shifts have also made it more possible for LGBT people to come out as such to their friends and family, and I believe that it's relationship, in Martin Buber's sense of the term, meaning an intimate connection with somebody else as opposed to just simply knowing them, that makes this possible. It makes it less plausible that a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender person would be somehow more flawed than a heterosexual or a cisgendered person, meaning not trans. And finally, in a world where information and people travel more and more quickly than ever before, it's become less plausible to many Christians and others that God's truth is small enough for one person to have gleaned it all already. And so many of my respondents take a postmodern approach to their faith, which they see as making them open to learning from others' experiences of the divine, rather than silencing or correcting them. And that includes learning from the experiences of LGBT people, as well as people of other faiths or people with no faith. Furthermore, when they adopt this perspective, the concept of Christian love becomes broader and more inclusive, and people feel less willing than they did before to judge or condemn others. Regardless of which process started someone on this path, they all lead participants in these movements to find the conventional approach of sacramental shame to seem profoundly unchristian. And I'll just add that we hypothesize that the same processes that make it possible for non-LGBT Christians to accept LGBT people also makes it possible to claim an LGBT identity for oneself.
All right. Our project achieves deep integration by interweaving sociological methods of data collection and analysis with philosophical methods of analysis and moral argumentation. These methods mutually inform each other and help us move beyond the methodological limits of each discipline taken on its own. So my work has primarily looked at spiritual violence, the impact of spiritual violence on the moral and spiritual self from the perspective of a feminist Christian virtue ethics. But one limitation of this approach is that I've only been able to gather data about people's experiences of spiritual violence from published statements. And so my conclusions remain somewhat speculative and in need of more empirical support or challenge. The contributions of this approach, however, are its ability to make ethical evaluations about this mode of violation and to provide a framework for distinguishing true from pseudo-virtue. Dawn has developed the concept of sacramental shame from what she has empirically observed as a qualitative sociologist. The contributions of her approach include access to deep, rich narratives of experience from multiple perspectives gathered in published documents, but also in participant observation and qualitative interviews. Second, these sociological methods are dynamic. They enable us to ask participants for further information and to see processes of change and development in real-world contexts over time. The limitations of this approach reside in sociology's inability to make ethical claims or to adjudicate among research participants varying accounts of virtue. So for instance, some Christians will say that Christian love means respecting and accepting even the most marginalized members of society, whereas others will say Christian love means shunning people who claim an LGBT identity in the hope that they'll correct themselves before it's too late. And as a sociologist, Dawn didn't have the normative framework to make an evaluation about which of those was more consistent with authentic Christian love. So in this project then, the deep integration will occur in processes of both data collection and analysis. Guided by both philosophical and sociological questions, we will gather data using sociological methods. Specifically, we will conduct participant observation at gatherings, conferences, and discussions among participants in these movements. We will conduct semi-structured interviews with participants, and we'll gather documents published by participants. We will use the qualitative data management package in vivo to identify themes, patterns, and trends in these data. An analysis will take place alongside data gathering, so that as new themes emerge, they can dynamically shape the questions we bring to the field and the themes we look for. The dynamic process will continue until no new themes are uncovered. Our analysis of the data will also take on a hybrid form. We will both generate theory from the ground up on the data we collect, based on the data we collect, and we will extend existing theoretical perspectives in feminist and queer theory, as well as in virtue ethics and violence studies, using the data. For example, sociological data about what motivates people to cultivate Christian love might actually also suggest a deeper understanding of or revision to dominant theoretical accounts of Christian virtue. Our methodological innovation then is to examine situated accounts and personal narratives of people's motivation to Christian virtue. Specifically, we are innovating methodology by framing sociological data in terms of virtue, while bringing these data to shed light on philosophical discussions of virtue in order to generate an empirically grounded, dynamic account of how people find the motivation to love and to overcome the spiritually violating impact of sacramental shame and related practices.
So this study will have an academic significance, a methodological significance, and a practical significance for those with an investment in the parts of life where spirituality and sexuality overlap. Academically, it will help us to understand how people develop the motivation to eradicate harmfully shaming stigmas in religious institutions and religious life, and how they transcend these practices. It will also help us to understand the social and ethical processes in which people are working to bring about an end to the so-called culture wars, the notion that LGBT people are the enemies of religion and that religion is the enemy of LGBT people. And it will break new ground in Christian virtue ethics, which largely assumes a healthy environment as the background conditions for character development. We'll add to this literature by focusing on how character develops in spiritually abusive environments and how people can both change and transcend these unhealthy dynamics. Methodologically, the study will provide an empirical grounding and/or a challenge to philosophical claims about the motivation to virtue, and it will develop a moral framework to guide the analysis of sociological data. Practically, the study will help Christians to understand both the harms and the gifts that Christianity brings to LGBT people. It will help us to identify what kinds of resources, languages, and framings can help movements for social justice to grow. And it will help the broader North American society to understand the changes happening in these large and influential religious communities by shedding light on how people have come to these movements, as well as the possibilities that these movements are creating. The challenges that we have to overcome will be of two sorts. First, we're going to have to find a way to reconcile normative philosophy and value-neutral sociology. This won't be quite as difficult as it seems, since sociology often has unspoken normative assumptions, such as the assumption that equality is a good thing or something like that. At the same time, we'll have to make it clear that while we're using sociological methods to gather data, our analysis will end up being something different from sociology. It'll be a hybrid. Second, we have a methodological barrier between us. We can overcome this in part because qualitative sociology is naturalistic. The goal is to go to people in their lives, speaking their language and the like, and thus the methods of data gathering draw on existing social skills and dispositions. And even though she's a philosopher, she's got them, she can do it. Indeed, Teresa's project has been inviting an interview component on its own, because when she talks about her work, people want to give her their narratives of their experiences of spiritual violence, etc. So to conclude, we believe the project is timely, urgently needed, and eminently doable if funded. And we thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Question? Yes, Doug.
I'm curious if you could elaborate a little bit on the types of theory that you see coming out of this, specifically regarding virtue, but also more generally.
Sure.
I can start. So one part that was so interesting for me is that in the Christian virtue ethics frameworks within which I've been operating, there's sort of a presumption that virtue develops over time through the participation in the ritual life of a faith community, and really focusing on worship and on ritual and the impact of how you come to embody a Christian interpretation of the Christian narrative. And so what was fascinating to me about Dawn's initial findings was pointing to sort of broader social processes that seem to be making it possible for people to cultivate Christian virtue that from within the tradition I'm operating would be surprising. So that would be one sort of new theoretical development in thinking about the three processes that she mentioned as being processes that seem to be conditions that are making possible the cultivation of Christian friendship with LGBT people, and that's really surprising and interesting to me. So that would be one example.
Okay. Other theoretical developments include, for instance, sort of building on Foucault's conception of sexuality. So the fact that sexuality didn't become a thing throughout the West at the same time, and that it's really just now taking hold in evangelical culture. So the question is, how did this come about now? Why? What are the conditions that actually made sexuality become a thing to a lot of people when it did in 1890, 1900? And how is it that process is continuing to unfold differently in different groups? Similarly, there are, in the sociology of religion, there are theories about, this, sort of the culture wars theories that talk about, this polarization of religious groups or worldviews, and so, that would say that if a Christian supports LGBT identities or accepts LGBT people, that puts them in the liberal camp. These Christians are actually distancing themselves from liberal Christians. They don't take a liberal approach to theology, even if they use some of the arguments that liberal theologians have been making since 1974.
Dan?
Can I just add?
Oh, go ahead.
Just one more interesting development, I think, and it's resonant with the first project that we heard from today. There's, in feminist treatments of virtue in virtue ethics and philosophy, there's sort of a secular account of how virtue is cultivated under oppressive conditions. But I'm interested in extending that to the case of religious context and spiritual context, so that would be another development.
Can you say a word about how you're going to sample your non-LGBT subjects in your project? And I guess one concern I have is that just like here at Marquette, there's a lot of different ways of being a Catholic. And depending on what kind of Christian church you're sampling from, and then within that church, whether it's left or right, you're going to get a very different story. So are you comfortable with the coverage of stories you're going to learn in your grounded theory approach?
Yeah, absolutely. What we're doing is we're not sampling churches. What we're doing is looking at the movements. So there are organizations in these movements that are bringing people together. When I was doing research on Protestant debates about homosexuality in the 1990s, there were conservative Christians who didn't think homosexuality was sinful or didn't think it was the big deal everybody made about it, but they couldn't find each other. And what now is happening, partly because of the internet, is that they're finding each other. And so we're actually focusing on organizations that are trying to bring this about. And so I've been doing participant observation with an organization called the Marin Foundation that one of the things that they do is to sponsor bi-weekly gatherings that they call Living in the Tension gatherings, where they cite Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail every time, saying that there's a productive tension that's necessary for growth, and so we're going to bring together people with different understandings, different theological understandings, different hermeneutic approaches to Scripture, and we're going to just talk about our experience and talk about our understandings without attacking each other and without feeling the need to destroy each other. So we're looking to where these discourses are being created as opposed to just kind of hoping we find them out there somewhere.
Questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Daniel.
Hey, so I'm interested in the concept of spiritual violence and your definition of it. So obviously you appreciate a cultural, historical perspective, and I also am aware that you have a normative framework that you're operating within. But I'm just curious, in our society, there's a very kind of individualistic understanding of religion, of involving a personal relationship with God, which is somewhat different from a lot of other more communalistic understandings of what it means to be religious. And so I'm wondering if you've thought about or would consider the possibility that for some people, being LGBT or being deviant in any way, if they define it as deviance, is an act of spiritual violence against the community. So being an individual who pursues a different way of relating to God that is not what the community approves of is actually seen as an act of violence that is bringing the community down, hurting the community's relationship to God. So I wonder, I mean, I could see how that would just fall outside of your normative framework, but I wonder if you've considered that
I am
possibility.
operating with different normative assumptions, but I certainly think it might be the case that some people would have that experience, a feeling violated by a personality that's presenting itself as deviant and claiming that in some way. So I think that a lot would probably hinge on the understanding of violation and the understanding of how spiritual selves are formed and always within communities. And so the understanding of violation I'm operating with is that a person is violated or experiences violation to the extent that they are the target of a agent-caused disrespectful harm that can significantly damage the self. So I would probably have to appeal to some kind of to that notion of violation. But I also think that you have to. We're taking a sort of. I'm taking a kind of normative stand by looking at the ways in which the experiences of different sets of people in these. I've been focusing mostly on Roman Catholic communities have borne out violation or not, and it seems like for people who for the white straight guy who's Roman Catholic. There isn't a lot of dissonance with that person's ability to connect with God, except when, those deviants come, right? But for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender person, we know it by its fruits, who's trying to be formed in this environment and experiencing a constant sense of dissonance and violation. The environment or the structure, even though it's about a personal relationship with God, the environment or the structure is clearly not cultivating for many, many people an experience of God as loving or supportive. So.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the violation that we're talking about, the shame isn't just like, I kind of feel bad about myself today. There are testimonies of people harming themselves to punish themselves for something that they can't change. It's a different substantive experience than like, you make me uncomfortable.
And maybe just to add to that, I think it's important to look at, and this is related to what I just said, but to the power dynamics in the religious community and who are the people who, are most, have identities that are most consonant with the levels of the structures of power.
I just want to push on that a little bit more. So suppose that, you're the straight white guy and you are, very well placed in the hierarchy of the church structure, and that I'm the lesbian And I don't present myself as deviant, right? But the person who is embedded in the hierarchy, in a place of power, interprets my person and my being as deviant. And because of that, I don't know if it's just like, oh, it makes me uncomfortable. I don't think that's the end of the story. It's, oh, it makes me feel that the whole structure in which I'm embedded and in which my life has meaning is being threatened or undermined by the existence of this person. So I think in terms of the definition you just gave of spiritual violation, that would apply.
Yeah,
it would
and
definitely apply.
thought
So I
about
think
that
that you should maybe take the point a little bit,
Yeah.
More deeply.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe one kind of response, I recognize that from the perspective of the person in that position, they might feel violated under that definition of violation.
Not only would they feel violated, they would feel the entire structure of their religion within
and so
which they're embedded and in which they're invested to be threatened by this individual. Now, it could be wrongly,
Right.
or falsely, but it's still their experience, and it's still, they claim legitimacy for it.
Yeah, so one of the, yes, I fully agree with, I agree with that. It's certainly true of people's experience. So one possible way of starting to address those kinds of questions is, in some ways, what was interesting about Dawn's research was that people were bracketing the question about the sinfulness of homosexuality and really recognizing that the inability to relate to each other from a posture of humility was getting in the way of their own experience of spirituality. So one way of starting to address those kinds of questions is looking at the ways that we're relating to one another, even independently of what we might believe about each other as being, as threatening our identity. There are virtues within the Christian tradition, Christian love, Christian humility, that are calling for a kind of encounter with the other. So that would be one way of sort of, without kind of coming down on one side or the other.
And just very quickly, because time is up. So these virtues that you're referring to, humility, charity, open-mindedness, would they be part of the feminist Christian virtues, or would there be a feminist interpretation of those virtues then that you would be advancing?
Yeah, that's what I'm interested in doing. So is looking at them as they've been traditionally articulated, but then looking at several things, both how in their traditional articulation contexts of spiritual abuse impede their development, but also how we might actually deepen our understanding of the nature of those virtues by paying attention to people in these movements, that they might revise those virtues.
Thank you very much.